Welcome the Five-Star Festival to campus this weekend, and the signature presentation for our weekend revolves around the topic of globalization, specifically including international education here at WNL. It's my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker for these sessions this afternoon. Our keynote and panel moderator is Professor Michael Anderson. He is the Robert E. Sadler Jr. Professor of Economics and Chair of the Department of Economics. His primary area of study is international economics with an emphasis on migration and trade. He teaches classes on international trade, international finance, and econometrics. He's on the board of Faith and Economics, an interdisciplinary journal published by the Association of Christian Economists. His talk this afternoon, to frame these issues, will examine how the various economic forces broadly called globalization have created both the potential for large economic gains, but also for conflict and loss. Please welcome to the podium Professor Michael Anderson.
Right, very good. Thank you. Well, Bo, thank you for those kind words of introduction, and it's a pleasure to be with everyone here today. I'd like to offer my own welcome to the five-star generals and their families back on campus. What an inspiration it is to see your love of the university. Great for me and an honor to be here. Well, I want to talk this evening about what has loosely been called globalization. It's a perfectly vague phrase capable of containing within itself both hope and fear. I did a library search at our Leyburn Library to see how many books contained that particular word. And the answer is we have almost 900 titles with the word globalization in it. I did the same search on Amazon and found 24,000 titles. Clearly, there's something in the air about the idea of globalization. The titles of the books themselves will tell you something. Here are a few that I liked. Globalization and the Race for Resources. That Used to Be Us, how America fell behind in the world it invented. And then one of my favorites, Crazy Like Us, the globalization of the American psyche. Well, behind these sometimes too provocative titles is a shared conviction among many of these authors that we live in the present reality of a globalized world, a world where borders have begun to lose their economic meaning and to become, as one author put it, empty lines on a globe. A place where, for example, if you're starting up a firm in the US, your competition is as likely to come from France as it is from a firm in Florida. Well, I'd like to contest that view this afternoon with a counterclaim that borders between nations powerfully separate people and markets. That's a bit of a departure from the gains and losses language advertised in the talk, but time remaining, I'll try to come back to those points as well. To frame the discussion, I'm going to be talking about what two prominent economists, Maurice Obstfeld and Ken Rogoff, have termed the 6 most important puzzles in international economics. Though in consideration of the time, I'll be talking about only 3 of them. Well, academics, as you may know, have a number of requirements placed upon them. We are required to have beards and tweed sport coats. And we're also required to begin every talk, actually, with historical context. So not wanting to get in trouble with my union rep, I'm going to give you a bit of historical context as well. That is, if I could make the slide back up. Is there a technician in the house? A technician in the house. My kingdom for a technician. All right, I'm going to proceed without it. Here we go. If you were able to see the chart that I was hoping to display to you, you'd be looking at U.S. exports and U.S. imports as a share of GDP. What you would see in that is not a steady trend upward. Imagine that you're looking at a chart of data that goes from the late 1860s up to 2009. What do U.S. exports and U.S. imports as a share of GDP look like, right? Think about what you've heard in the literature, this new era of globalization, right? You might imagine kind of a straight line going up, exports rising, imports rising. That's not what the graph shows. What the graph shows is two waves. We had an efflorescence of trade and globalization up to the 1920s. Then there was a collapse in the wave, and then long about 1977, those numbers began to rise dramatically again. And so what we are seeing, not only in the United States, but the world around, is that we are indeed experiencing globalization, but it is a back-to-the-future experience where the world is recovering something that used to exist before the Great Depression. So in talking about globalization, it's possible to make a couple of mistakes. One mistake would be to say that we're really experiencing something wholly new, when in fact we are rediscovering something that occurred 100 years ago. The second mistake I'm going to argue tonight is that we can claim that borders have lost their meaning, that we truly live in a flat world, a phrase you may have heard from a popular author, where again, borders matter less and less, right? One integrated world market. Well, how do we make the claim that borders are still, as I claim, powerful separators of people and markets? I'd like to offer you 3 bits of evidence from 3 of the puzzles that Maurice Obstfeld and Ken Rogoff described. And then at the end of today's talk, I'm going to come back around and make the claim that human relationships can sometimes bring together what borders have otherwise separated. So, the claim: borders matter, and in fact, they're hugely important for economics. We began to get evidence on that in 1980 from a pair of authors, Feldstein and Horioka. Feldstein and Horioka had a very interesting, oh, check it out, I'm back live. I absolutely love it. There it is, there's my chart. Do you see the 2 waves, right? We got the wave up to the 20s, the collapse of the wave, and then the rise of the wave again. And now with that, I'm going to turn that part back off. We began to get evidence that borders matter from the authors Feldstein and Horioka in 1980, who asked a very simple question. They said, what is the relationship between a country's savings and its investment? Right? Let's look from one country to another country around the world and ask, what is the correlation between what a country saves, right, and what they invest? And by invest, I mean building productive investments, the building of factories and buildings and dams and barbed wire fences, that sort of thing. What is the correlation that we find between those two? Now, stay with the thought experiment for a minute and let's ask, if we lived in a flat world where borders didn't matter, what would you expect to find? Suppose you have an idea for a new factory. It's got a high rate of return, but you don't have much savings amongst your fellow citizens to build it. Would that matter? It would not matter. Do you agree? Because you could import the money to build that factory. You could get the money from France, or I guess more likely China, and build a factory. The fact that your fellow citizens weren't savers would matter very little. So it was therefore surprising when Feldstein and Horioka found a correlation between a nation's savings and their investment roughly equal to 1. That is to say, if you're going to build a factory in your country, your own citizens better save the money to build it or it's not going to get built. Just an astounding finding that took the economics profession by surprise. You can Google it sometime. It's called the Feldstein-Horioka paradox. There's a cottage industry trying to explain it. I'll offer one explanation this evening in a bit. But it is one of the 6 most important puzzles identified by Obstfeld and Rogoff. Why is it that borders, would be interrupting so profoundly the flow of financial investment. By the way, that correlation has gone down over time. In more recent studies, the correlation is about 0.6. So moving towards globalization, but be mindful of the idea that 0.6 is still a long ways away from 0. Okay, what's going on? What's going on? I'm going to hold back my story, and I'm going to give you a couple more puzzles. And the second puzzle is going to come from a guy named John McCollum, who wrote a paper in 1995. And in that paper, he looked at trade within Canada, and compared that to trade between Canada and the United States. And here's his question: how much larger is trade within Canada than it is between Canada and the United States? So let's think about that for a minute. What do you mean by trade within Canada? Well, it turns out that the Canadian provinces keep track of their trade statistics just like they're little independent countries. Ontario can tell you how much it trades with Saskatchewan, and they can tell you how much they trade with Michigan. So what would you expect to find? Trade within Canada compared to trade between Canada and the US. What would be the ratio of those two things? And to help you out, I'm going to give you a chart. This appeared in McCollum's original paper. Here you see a map of Canada and the United States, the 10 Canadian provinces and the continental states. The circles that you see are the measure of that province's or state's economic output. Canadian provinces are in black, US states are in white. If you were Ontario, see the big black circle? How much would you trade with British Columbia, sitting over there on the Pacific, versus how much you would trade with California? They're about equidistant from you, are they not? And California is much larger. So how much would you trade inside the country versus sending your products to California? And to deepen this a bit, suppose that I had asked you before you walked in here today to name the most benign international border in the world. I think many of you would have offered the Canada-US border as the most benign border, right? It's unguarded, peaceful, similar legal systems, same language. In fact, it's kind of a boring border, isn't it? There was a contest to come up with the most boring book title, and the winning book title was Canada, Friendly Giant to the North. The border just doesn't matter very much, does it? Well, but hold on, you say. At the time McCollum was writing, there were still tariffs and there were still quotas, so that border is surely going to matter somewhat, right? And if you're going to try to ship your goods, you're going to have time delays, there's health and safety restrictions, and on it goes. So perhaps you do have a preference to trade inside of Canada than trading with the United States. So what's your number? Will trade inside of Canada be 1.5 times as large as trade between Canada and the US? Will it be 2 times as large? Well, to keep you guessing no further, what McCollum found is that trade inside of Canada, after you control for everything else, control for economic sizes, distances, and everything else, is 22 times larger than trade between Canada and the United States. That border has a tremendous trade-reducing effect. I heard a prominent economist say that after he heard McCollum present his paper, he knew immediately that it was the most important empirical result that he had ever heard. And so now we've got 2 of the puzzles that were introduced by Obstfeld and Rogoff. Borders are interrupting flows of financial capital, and they're powerfully redirecting trade from crossing borders to staying inside of the country. What could it be? Why do borders matter so much? Again, I've got a story for you, but let me give you one more puzzle. And this comes from another pair of authors. These guys are named Engel and Rogers. And they're not looking at financial flows, they're not looking at trade flows. What they looked at was prices. You guys are a well-traveled group. You know that when you travel from city to city, prices vary substantially, right? The difference between prices between Paris and London, very large. Heck, between Miami and New York, you get very big price differences in the price of gas, the price of automobiles, and so on. And you've also observed that the further apart are the city locations, often the bigger the price gaps. Not surprising, right? Transportation costs and all of that. Well, Engel and Rogers also looked at Canada and the United States, but they weren't looking at trade, they were looking at price gaps. They had data on the prices of products in cities in the United States and cities in Canada. So let's compare price gaps inside of the US, compare price gaps inside of Canada, and then compare them between the US and Canada. Are you with me? And you will not be surprised to find what they found, which is that the larger is the distance, the larger the price gaps. And when you cross a border for a given distance, the price gap is going to go up, whether you're talking about a bottle of wine or an automobile, a cab ride, or a trip to the doctor. Well, by the nature of their analysis, they had the ability to express the border in distance terms. Do you see? If you know the effect of distance on price gaps, and if you know the effect of the border on price gaps, you can say, well, if the border were distance in terms of what it does to opening up differences in prices, how wide would it be? Well, in the original version of their paper, in a working paper version, they had a hand-drawn graph that answers the question that's in the title of their paper, which is, how wide is the border? And there it is. To account for what the border does to price gaps, the border has to be at a minimum 6,000 miles wide. So we now have the third puzzle that Obstfeld and Rogoff have charged economists to solve. Why is it that borders have this tremendous effect on financial flows, on trade flows, and in opening up price gaps? And I'll take away that little hand-drawn drawing. All right, so I've got a story for you. I'll be interested to hear whether you buy it or not. It actually comes from the work of yet another economist, and that guy's name is James Roush. He wasn't working on these puzzles, but instead he was asking a different question, which I think comes to this topic quite importantly. He asked this. He said, if you look at trading pairs of countries around the world, grab a pair of countries, grab another pair, grab a third pair, and so on, you'll find that some pairs of countries trade a lot more with each other, some a lot less. His question was, why do some country pairs trade so much, others so little? And he looked at the things that you and I would probably think to look at. He said, well, what's the economic size of one trading pair compared to another? What's the distance between one trading pair compared to another? Is one trading pair in a free trade area and the other not, let's say? Those are sort of standard things you'd think about. But then he posed another possibility which I found interesting. He said, what is the number of ethnic Chinese living in one country pair versus another? His hypothesis was that the number of ethnic Chinese, if you have a lot of those folks living in your country pair, you'll experience more trade than you will if you don't have ethnic Chinese living in your country. Now, how's that for a hypothesis? Why would that matter? How could it possibly matter that you have ethnic Chinese living in your country? They're a minority all around the world, except in their own country, right? There is a global diaspora of these guys, but how can they affect a country's trade volumes? Here's his story. And I'll give it to you and I'll pose it to you as a question. Suppose that you're in Malaysia and you're looking to sell your stereos in Europe. You say, look, I got a good product. I know I can produce them cheaply. I think I could sell those things. You face a couple of problems, don't you? One of the problems that you face is information. You say, look, if I'm going to sell these things in Europe, what should they look like? What's the price point? And how do I get access to the retail network? You're going to need a partner in Europe, aren't you, to help you with those particular questions. And then you see the other problem that you face, and that's trust. Find a partner in Europe. How will you find one that's worthy of trust and is not going to badly rip you off in the deal? And if you do get ripped off in the deal, what will you do? I mean, travel to Europe and sue him? You can understand facing those two issues, information, trust, why a lot of potential traders just end up saying, you know what, I'm going to stay at home. Unless, Roush argues, that you're part of what he calls the ethnic Chinese trading network. This diaspora of Chinese can be characterized, on average, accurately as being a kind of a middle human capital level. They're not typically the guys driving the cabs. They're not typically the guys who are the lawyers and the doctors. They're that middle human capital stripe. They're merchants, tightly glued up to each other by virtue of shared language, shared ethnicity, shared occupation, and the gluing effect of being a minority in their host country. Roush further argues that they indeed trade inside of the network. They provide the information and they provide the critical element, which is trust. And it works this way. You can renege on a deal if you want to and make money that way, and you are forever expelled from the trading network as a result. It's a one and done story. No expensive contracts and no suing. It's purely you fulfill your end of the deal. Roush argues that a merchant in that organization would rather lose money on a deal, much rather lose money on a deal, than be potentially banned from trading with folks for reneging. Well, my co-authors, Martin Davies and Stephen Smith, and I were intrigued by this, and we wanted to apply it to the puzzles to see whether we could explain any of them with this idea that ethnicity transcends the border. And you might think, given what I said about Roush, that we were going to look at trade, but we thought, you know what, Roush has already done that. Let's try to do something a bit more novel. And so we looked at price gaps around the world. We have a data set of 2 million observations on over 200 products in 100 cities around the world, 1990 to 2008. Do you want to know the price of toilet paper in Kuala Lumpur in 2004? Or the price of a bottle of wine in Paris in 1990? Or what it costs to go to the doctor in London in any of those years? We can actually tell you in this data set. And we look at the number of ethnic Chinese that live in these locations around the world. And our question is this: where the Chinese are present, if they're causing the kind of trade that is predicted, will we find the price gaps, do you see, commensurately decline? Where the Chinese exist, are markets more integrated, prices closer to each other, or do we not find that result? This paper, by the way, cross your fingers for us. We're about to send it off to an economics journal. We hope to get it published. But let me give you the money quote. The money quote is that where the Chinese are present, price gap, if they're present at the levels you find in Southeast Asia, you would expect the price gaps to go away by about 25%. Fully a quarter of the big price wedges that you observe when you travel city to city around the US, internationally, go away if the ethnic Chinese are there in substantial numbers. And so we were quite excited to find it. Now, that's our conclusion. And what I'm going to tell you lastly is we doubted whether we were finding something real. Maybe you doubt as well. And we asked ourselves a couple of questions. We said, look, how do we know it's the ethnic Chinese that are having this effect on markets, integrating them, lowering price gaps between city locations? Maybe it's other ethnicities that are doing it as well. There's Indians who live around the world, right? There are, Kyrgyz folks Japanese folks who live around the world, why focus on the Chinese just because Roush shone a flashlight on them? Could it be that the Indians have this effect? Another counter-hypothesis that we wanted to look at was maybe we're putting the cart before the horse. We're arguing that the ethnic Chinese integrate markets because of their trading effects, right? Lowering price gaps as they trade more with each other. But maybe it's a different story. Migrants are of all people the most mobile, right? If you were a Chinese immigrant, where would you choose to locate? You perhaps would go to places where markets are integrated, right? Where price gaps are low, those are places you might decide, hey, that's a place I want to call home. Not because you're particularly concerned about the size of price gaps, but you want markets which are well integrated with world markets. That sounds perhaps like a more profitable place to make a living. Well, to test those hypotheses, we actually included in our database the number of ethnic Indians living in those locations and the number of the ethnic Japanese. There's a diaspora of those guys as well, although it's much smaller. And what do you think we found? What we found is that the Chinese, where they are present in between locations, price gaps substantially decline. As for the Indian ethnicity or the Japanese ethnicity, absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. There is actually no effect on market integration for locations where the Indians have taken residence or where the folks of Japanese ancestry have taken residence. And you say, now how could it be? Why would the Chinese be so different, so special? And I'll go back to where I was to begin with, which is the nature of this Japanese ethnic trading, or the Chinese ethnic trading network. They're of that middle human capital. They're merchants, right? They glue up together by virtue of shared language, shared ethnicity, shared occupation. When you travel from city to city, when you went to a big city, was there a Chinatown where you were? Now, I'll bet there was. I had dinner in Chinatown in DC not that long ago. Although to call those few blocks of Chinatown is maybe stretching it a bit. When was the last time you visited a city and found India Town or Japan Town? These particular ethnicities have blended into their host communities. And they're found more broadly across the human capital distribution as well. So, as I am now nearly out of time, that costs and benefits language that was promised in the title of the talk, I'm going to set aside. Nevertheless, I will say that my co-authors and I are quite provoked by how borders have such a profound effect on international markets. And we find quite interesting the idea that sometimes human relationships can bring together what borders would otherwise separate. So thank you for listening to me today. If you have a question, I'm happy to take them. There is going to be a quiz, so you'll... Sure.
How should your findings, yours and your colleagues, affect our domestic trade and foreign trade policy?
I'm sorry, could you give me that one more time?
How will the findings of your study and your colleagues affect our domestic and international trade policy?
So, yeah, domestic trade policy, international trade policy is certainly moving towards a more globalized form. I mean, that is its inevitable track. And to be honest with you, I would say that the effect is essentially zero. I would hope that trade policy will account for the gains and losses. Globalization is not a lossless proposition. If there is lots of trade, there are going to be big winners and big losers. And so it is certainly my desire that any policy would account for that distinction, but I can't claim any information or any hope that that is in fact the case. Yes?
I have a question. You said that Chinese present in substantial numbers.
Yes.
How do you quantify substantial numbers?
Right. So the
population?
so as a percent of population, the numbers are so small because they are such a small minority, the worldwide. But if you have ethnic Chinese that go up to, you know, a tenth of 1% of your population share, you're now beginning to see what I would call substantial members of that ethnic group.
Are there certain areas of the country where you have quantified this tenth of a percent?
See, that's a really interesting question. One of the things we want to do is to get more detailed data. We're really working with aggregate country data. We'd like to have city data. We'd like to know how many Chinese live in Cleveland, you know, how many live in Lexington, Kentucky. But we just don't have that yet. But that's exactly what we'd like to do.
Do we know what the percentage of ethnic Chinese are in the United States?
We do. I don't have that number with me, but we do. We do know it nationally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it under 10%?
Yes. Oh, way under. Way under. Yeah. Good questions. Keep them coming. Yes.
What's been the effect, if it's been studied, on the establishment of the euro within Europe or Europe and other countries?
Yeah. As related to there's a lot of study on the establishment of the euro on trade. Does a common currency influence trade? And the answer to that is yes. A common currency has a substantial trade increasing effect. But as related to my particular topic, very little overlap. Common currencies, it surprised the economists. Because prior to the euro, we would have said, what is the effect of a common currency on trade? Probably nothing, we would have said, because you can fix your exchange rate. Who needs a single currency? Just fix the exchange rate between the mark and the franc. What more do you accomplish by having a single currency? But as it turns out, when you look at the trade flows, the answer is it grows a lot. So that was actually a surprise. Keep them coming. Yes.
The trade between the U.S. and Canada,
Yes.
within Canada, Canada's a tenth of the population of the U.S.
Yes.
Is a lot of that trade also going across Canada for export?
Right. And so one of the possibilities is that we are really mismeasuring what we call trade. So maybe you're putting intermediate goods next to where final goods are produced, right? So the tire factory next to the Canadian car plant gets counted as intra-Canadian trade, right? Whereas they would never have imagined that they were going to ship those tires to the US. It's really built around getting Ford Motor Company in Canada the tires they need. So that's one possibility. But in general, I don't believe it. That's been examined, and I don't think that story is as compelling. Although I've got a co-author and a friend of mine who thinks very strongly of that hypothesis. So I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm personally not convinced by it. Yes?
Specializing in South Asia, I was particularly intrigued by your observations on the Indian negative or the neutral effect of concentration of Indians.
Yes.
And I wondered, I was searching around in my own head to try and figure out why it's so different.
Yeah.
And I guess if you're taking the data right now, it has something to do with what she said, that the South Asians are coming a much wider range of social positions.
Exactly.
But within that, I wonder whether if you could select somehow and look only at merchant castes. I mean, they're extremely clannish. And
Yeah.
that way, the individual castes are just like these
Oh.
Chinese communities.
Oh. Well, that's called a research question. I like that idea real well. Hang around after the talk, would you? We did think about looking for, what are other examples of merchant ethnic groups? The Lebanese have that reputation, right? I'm interested in anthropologists or sociologists who could give us some guidance. I know as an economist, I have not thought enough about ethnicity. This has convinced me of that. So caste ideas in India, that's an intriguing idea.
Yeah, I think you'd have to look at particular, like these Gujarati, this is what we've got in Roanoke, is
Yeah?
All Gujaratis.
Is that right?
All merchants, but that's their specialty.
Right, right. And there's going to be variance, right? But if I could zero in a little bit, that would be fantastic. All right, well, I believe I'm at time, so thank you guys very much for an enjoyable time together.